appreciate y'all being here, guys. I want to share with you a few other things that Guy and I are working on from an agronomic standpoint. Guy really hit it on the nail on the head that varieties are important. I mean, there's always issues to talk about varieties, and I think there will continue to be as we move forward. It never seems to cease that we have new varieties to talk about and new varieties to see where they fit, and hopefully that all means we're moving forward. I think that's probably the best thing about the variety debate. One thing that Guy and I have really worked on the past few years is PGR regimes and the idea of how to manage these new varieties with PGRs. The first question usually, once a grower decides to choose a certain variety, how do I manage it? A lot of times that relates to PGR management, and it may relate to earliness, how we can manage these varieties to fit a certain situation or manage a variety where we can maximize yields. We've done a lot of work on PGRs and won't share with you a lot of the information we've got. I do want to share with you kind of what our thoughts on where these varieties fit. But you guys know in general, and I think Dr. Brown mentioned it in his talk earlier today, in a lot of cases we can overdo it with PGRs. And if you think about it from another standpoint, a lot of these newer varieties are easier to manage with PGRs. From the standpoint of, compared to the 555 and some of the more full season varieties we've gone in the past, we can be a little less prophylactic or a little less upfront in how we manage these varieties. This was just a picture from Dr. Collins' trial that we do where we manage varieties without pics at all and then manage them with a heavier type regime. And you can see that in Georgia we have one of the longest growing seasons of anywhere in the country. And if we do overdo it, and in this case you're looking at the same variety, and on the right we did a really good job, so to speak, with PGRs. We really limited growth and limited nodes. And ultimately, we probably reduced the number of fruiting sites on that plant. You can see here you got a lot more nodes. You do have a lot bigger plant, but in this case, we certainly hurt yields from the standpoint of overdoing it with PGRs. I think another thing to think about PGRs and with all these new varieties is, I think if you ask 5 growers how they want to manage cotton, they're all going to have a different idea of what they want to get out of a PGR regime. Some want to manage cotton for earliness, some want to let it get bigger, some are concerned with really managing height, some aren't. So what we've tried to do, rather than say manage this variety this way and manage this other variety this way, is we tried to classify varieties based on their potential. And we've shown you this in the past, and we continue to add new varieties to it. And we've kind of tried to fit varieties based on their similar growth patterns and maybe how they respond to PGRs. We looked at a lot of new varieties this year. All the ones in the county trial, I had in a trial this year where we looked at PGRs, and we tried to fit them into that certain classification. You can see that basically our grouping system or our classification system, we have varieties at the top we feel like have the most growth potential or probably need the highest level of PGR management, down to the ones at the bottom here where we feel like in most cases if we get a good fruit retention, we may not need any PGRs at all. I do encourage guys, if they're going to think about where these varieties fit. We did have a lot of them we added this year, and last year was kind of a different year as far as had a lot of water and growing conditions may not have been perfect. So if you do have an idea about a variety, do ask your seed company. But in general, what we're trying to do with this, rather than say, I want to plant 1252 for the first time this year, how do I manage it? Rather than tell you to manage it a certain way, we can say, well, it grows similarly and has similar growth patterns to 1050. So if you grew 1050 in the past, you may be able to think about how to manage it. From the other standpoint, I grew Phygen 499 last year, and I want to plant one of the newer Phygens 339 or 575. From what we've seen so far, they seem to be fairly similar in the standpoint they can be pretty growthy. And again, you may want to ask the guys that are dealt with these varieties more often, since we do have 1 year data with these. Has anybody got any ideas or thoughts on varieties? Dr. Brown, you kind of agree with that? Yeah, those are the two right here that I'm not, like I said, we've got 1 year data, and to be honest with you, my trial was not the best.
The first place I get a little nervous is being real early. Mm-hmm. And people know how to do their own, but I get a little nervous when people start at early square rather than close to first bloom. I think that's where we hurt ourselves. But again, I like the first bloom or just prior to first bloom type approach, and those are growthy varieties that you've got in that top category for sure.
I think the biggest thing that, from a managing and time standpoint, is what we've seen, and we did a trial for 2 years now with 499, which is one of the growthiest ones we have. we looked at the timing of sequential application, and that's really where we made the biggest difference season long on how we were able to manage it. If we waited 2 weeks after our first application, regardless of when we started, we can control it, but if we wait 3, we kind of missed the boat. So I think that's pretty important. Next thing, I know I'm tired of talking about varieties and thinking about varieties. If I had $1 every time a guy mentioned varieties and I mentioned varieties, I could retire. But kind of wanted to think about something different from an agronomic standpoint. One thing I notice every year is we do variety trials. We think about, the first thing we think about what kind of plant population we're shooting for, what's our seeding rate. And if you think about it, we've got a lot of data on seeding rates and plant populations, but that data is a little more than 10, 15 years old now. And the big difference now, I think, is if you looked at the data we had from 95 to 97 and even earlier, it was done probably with one variety. Dr. Brown, do you remember that data? Was it most of it with 555 or ideas on plant populations and seeding rates? Most of it probably was.
Too early.
Yeah, it was too early.
But that was in advance of the transgenic era when you're trying to go as low as you could go
Yeah.
to minimize cost.
When did Josh do? Josh did some stuff in what?
Early 2000s? Is that right? That's
I'm not sure.
But irregardless, I think everything we've seen so far says that, up to 1.2 to 1.9, I think you can maximize yield as far as plant population. I think it made a difference. The big thing for me is what about new varieties?
Especially if we're really trying to shoot for higher yields, does that change or is that different? Especially thinking about cotton yields back in that period of time. So we kind of did a few plant population studies. I'll share you with you a little bit of data. In this trial, we basically went out and planted stands pretty thick, and we actually went back and thinned populations to certain plant populations and different spacings. We had 4 plant populations in this trial. We had a half a plant per foot, or 1 every 24 inches, 1 every 12, 1 every 8, and 1 every 4.8, which translated to a half a plant per foot, 1 per foot, 1.5, and 2.5 plants per foot. We had 499s of variety just in this study. And we also had these 4 plant populations when we didn't use any PGRs and when I used a pretty heavy level of management, thinking that we may have an interaction of optimum plant spacing versus PGR regime. In general, we didn't see any interaction between those two, whereas if we didn't have any PGRs or we did, we saw the same response. And that response was we saw higher yields with higher plant populations, to the point where we seemed to maximize yields when we had at least 1.5 plants per foot of row, which doesn't disagree with what we know so far. I think the take home is that if we were going to go cotton and we had 1 plant per foot of row, which is what a lot of people feel like we need to have to do a good job as far as yields, if I was going to make 1,700 pound cotton, I'd be excited about it. But could you push it to another level? And that's kind of where we saw. Did another study where we looked at quite a few more plant populations. Again, went back and thinned those to certain plant populations. We looked at 2 varieties, 499 and then Delta Pine 1137. You can look at lint yields here. We got LSD letters above the 1137 variety, but then we actually didn't see any statistical difference in yield looking at 499. Whereas with the 1137, we saw increasing yields when we got to 1.5 to 2 plants per foot of row. What does that mean? I think, if anything, Dr. Brown may say, well, you ain't got to plant as many seed with the Phygen variety, right? Or Monsanto may say plant more. I don't think that's the case, but I think it may mean that there are going to be some differences with varieties if we really want to get detailed about plant populations. Why would one be different than the other? And I think it may be plant canopy architecture, a vegetative branch, or lack of one, may be part of that. Same data if you kind of just put a curve to it. If you were looking at it, in both cases, 1.5 plants per foot of row or a little bit better seem to maximize yields for us. Nothing new, but I think if anything, it does show the importance of having a good plant stand. One other thing, after I planned all these plant population studies, the next thing I thought, well, we don't talk about plant populations, we talk about seeding rates. And that's not always the same thing, right? So what we went in and did is we actually planted had 3 different seeding rates. We planted 1, 2, and 3 seed per foot of row. Again, this isn't hill drop, this is even spacing. And we did it with 3 varieties, 1137, 499, and the Stoneville 6448. And what we basically saw is that all 3 varieties in this study responded similarly to these 3 different seeding rates. Whereas again, we saw an increase in yield as we increased our seeding rate. In this case, 2 or 3 seed per foot of row was anywhere from 140 to almost 200 pounds an acre, better than 1 seed per foot of row. So again, I think it shows the benefit of that. One thing to think about in this study is that we had really good germination or survivability of what we put, the seed we put in the ground, anywhere from 85 to 93%. This may all change if we're talking about when we have poor germination. So I think that's just something else to consider. If, if we're not going to get that good of germination, is that we're going to see the same thing. The last thing I'll mention on this, I think, as far as plant populations, I don't think we're going to change our idea on it, but I think it does show the importance of it. The big thing for me is, and we tried to look at this year, and ultimately the trial I had didn't turn out well, but this is all with even spaced seed, 1 seed per hill. What happens when we do hill drop? If we had 2 seed per 1 hill or 2 seed per, per foot of row, is that going to be different? I kind of feel like a lot of times if we do actually get the 2 seed in the same hole, which doesn't seem to always happen, we may have a difference of response there. Does anybody, y'all have any ideas on that? What do y'all think?
I know when you plant 2 on 12, 24-inch skip, 10% of the time is too much.
Yeah. And then if you had 2, if you ultimately get them in the same hole, that's another thing. Often when we plant hill drop, it's not always on in that same hole. We do.
Typically within a few inches.
Yeah. And you have that kind of wheat. You gotta have a competition deal where one plant may be more competitive than another. So I think that's something else we'll be able to look at next year.
I had a question for you on your study where you had where you had pics and 0 pics.
Yeah.
What was your no pics unmanageable in terms of plant height? I know that's just a ballpark question.
No, I think, is this talk?
I'd say that's unmanageable.
That's unmanageable.
Okay.
But unmanageable, in our case, we made a much better cut than not using pics.
What was your PGR regime? I mean, how aggressive?
A pint at match head, a pint at bloom, and a pint 2 weeks later.
Heinz next year?
What we were really trying to do is really see if you overdid it from that standpoint. That's what I was doing, 555 types.
Jerry, do you think we have any germplasm out there now that's a match head, 10-inch square growth regulation? I mean,
With the pint?
In generalized, any amount of pics at 10-head square.
At 555, I think that was the model for that.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm not so sure that any of the varieties we have now, unless they're on really, high nitrogen soils, or you got to feel it's aggressive. It really need that.
We
First bloom around 850 or something like that. That really seems to me to be the window now, just generalized.
I think I agree with you. I don't think it's that pinhead square.
It might not even be a pint, maybe 12 ounces.
We did. Me and Guy have done it the past 2 years. I didn't share it with you, Scott. What we did is we were looking at this sequential timing thing, and ultimately what it takes. You hear stories about people using a gallon of pics, and I couldn't control it. Well, what that ultimately was is what we think is just waiting too long in between timings. But in that same study, we had a pint at bloom, waited 2 weeks or 3 weeks, and then did it again. So it was either 2 shots at bloom, a shot at bloom 2 weeks later, a shot at bloom 3 weeks later, and then 2 weeks later and 3 weeks later. So it was really spaced out or not spaced out. Without looking at the data, we also incorporated an 8-ounce rate at match head square. And if we had that 8-ounce rate at match head square, that 2 to 3 week thing didn't matter as much. So I think, it's kind of an idea of loading it up front. And I think if you're going to be really timely, I don't think you need to start that early. But if you're in a situation where you're not going to be timely, I think there may be some advantage to doing some of that at lower rates. But I think you certainly can overdo it.
I think with 1137 or 1252 or in a handful of other varieties, you can get away with that.
If you were growing 1359 here, you can grow it just like you grew 555. You just load it up and it doesn't seem to matter. But typically down in our part of the world, when people have to put 80, 100, 110 ounces, they're behind just really high rates of nitrogen or long-term chicken litter production or on a vegetable farm where they put cotton. If it's a typical long-term cotton farm with a peanut rotation on 35 years, you generally don't ever see the need to go before that, right before first bloom.
It depends on the variety,
It may not need any.
That's right. Yeah.
What was the window of time between harvest of no PGR and maximum PGR? Did you gather it all at the same time?
And this kind of goes back to, I don't think I penalized either one of them. I really don't. There wasn't any cotton on the ground.
I do know that used to, when we did a lot of pick studies back in Johnny's day, if you defoliated the whole thing at the same time, when the bulk of the cotton was ready,
The stuff that wasn't free, you were picking it too early. And you were penalizing it because the one balls that really weren't ready.
So that kind of goes back to what Guy was kind of saying. It surprises, like you said, there may be differences there. Like you said, you can't always see it, but
basically what we saw was we never made any difference.
What kind of nitrogen would you have had under this cotton?
30 up front and 60 behind.
That's good cotton.
Yeah, this was the best cotton on the station. It was on the ridge, and it's always made the poorest cottons. You know, that kind of thing. You saw. Last thing I'll share with you real quick is, you guys know we planted a lot of cotton too late this last year, right? And a lot of cotton was delayed in how it matured. You know, we always get these questions about when's the last bloom date, when's the last day we can make a bloom. You know, is it September 1st? Is it the 5th? Is it the 15th? Some people say it's the 20th. Where is it? We kind of wanted to revisit that. You know, that's right.
Between September 1 and September 25th.
There you go.
Most often.
What we kind of did, if you ask around, Scott was the one that really had the idea. If you look at the literature and if you think about bowl maturation or from a flower to an open or harvestable bowl, a lot of times people say it takes so many heat units or DD60s to get that way. And if you're talking about during regular type in the middle of the season, 700 to 850 is what we've kind of documented as far as literature. But what happens when we're talking about this really late cotton? How late is too late?
Maturation and pickable bowls.
Pickable bowls. That's right. Well, I would think that and what we're talking about is from maturation being a pickable bowl. And I agree, that's not always the same thing. So what we're trying to do is we wanted to say, well, what is that? How many heat units does that take? And Scott Brown said 560. Isn't that your number?
Yep.
From observations in Moultrie, right?
20-some-odd years.
Yep. So we kind of went and basically what we did is we went and tagged bowls and blooms from across the state. You can see where we did it last year. Basically went in from late August to late September, tagged blooms in late planted fields, and kind of watched those bowls to see if we made it to harvest. In all actuality, what we did is we went in after a frost, honestly, and close to as harvest as we could get, and we kind of gave it a rating from 1 being it fluffed out purdy and 10 being it didn't open at all, 5 being kind of the difference between cracked and uncracked. I did some kind of extrapolating and some figuring, but what we tried to do is figure out the number of days we had between, flower date and then ultimately, in this case, the first frost date. All this cotton was harvested after our first frost date, so we kind of stopped it as far as heat unit accumulation at that point. From those 8 locations, if you figure what we kind of did is we figured our last effective bloom date. If we used from a flower occurring on a certain day to when we could harvest it, it averaged on September the 7th. So honestly, right in the middle of that 1st to 14th, right? It ranged from September 2nd to September 11th. You can see the number of days that we had between a flower and frost. It averaged 56 days, and we went from 48 in some cases up to 63 in others. As far as the number of heat units, and we went and used weather station data nearby, it averaged about 597 heat units. I don't think that's very far off, if different at all from what Scott's seen. So it kind of gave us another idea of where this thing works and another snapshot of it. I think the big thing for us is it helps us, if we've got guys wanting to plant late planted cotton, how do we manage it? How late do we go? If we use 600 heat units, what I did is I went back to Midville's data, weather data for the past 10 years, and used that 600 heat units number. If you use that 600 heat units number, the average last bloom date was September 5th, which to me was honestly earlier than I thought it would be. And it ranged from the 2nd of September to the 16th of September. One thing to think about it is, do we always want to farm cotton on averages or what the worst case is? It averaged on the 5th, but in general, in 3 of those 10 years, it was on the 2nd of September or earlier. So, if you were going to say September 2nd is our last effective bloom date in Midville, when do we need to plant cotton to get good yields? How many weeks of bloom do we need, Dr. Roberts? 4. We just said I'm not. That number can vary. let's just say 4 to get some kind of yield. If you kind of do some backtracking, we think it's anywhere from 55 to 70 days till we get to a bloom. That can be variable, but if you figure from September 2nd back 55 or 70 days, that gets us our first bloom date on on July the 9th or June the 24th. If you figure we need 4 weeks of bloom, when have we got to plant cotton in mid-field to make good yields? Between the 10th of June and honestly, if we're later as far as when we start to flower, as early as the middle of the end of May. I don't think that's perfect. I think we probably got to do it again for several years to really get an idea of where it really fits. But and there's probably some other things that factor into that, not only just heat units, cloudy days, sunny days, that kind of thing. If anything, it kind of opened my eyes to how we kind of need to manage cotton. I think a lot of people in Midville and that area north, we think, well, we can make cotton later in September. And that may disagree with that. I think that's all I got.
I think using Midville at 5th that's really in close compliance with what I've seen, because Moultrie is a good bit farther south, and I'm talking generally 5 to 7 days. The 10th to the 12th, that's kind of my window.
Yeah, and I think if you used 600 and went back and did 10 years, I hadn't done it, but I think there's going to be some difference there.
That would be great data to do over time. And 2013 on the whole was, the end was more challenged and punished than any year I can remember, but that would be great over time.
Yeah, and what I kind of envisioned is, I'm not smart enough to do it, but if we had some of this heat unit stuff over several years, you make a map, and this is your bloom date, and it's different color, just like a temperature map. This is your 100% day, this is your 50% day, and that kind of thing. That's right. I'm not smart enough to do it though. Anything else?
Don't you think we were more carbon challenged too this year at the end? Leaf canopies, and the root system, the root system that has so much to do with carbon, but I mean the other sort of.
We were challenged in a lot of ways at the end of the year.
I'd like to see you do that 5 years.
Mm-hmm.
I'd like to see you do it.
But what? Honestly, it was.
I'd like to see you do it at
Tifton or Moultrie and Plains and.
It was actually easier than I thought it'd be. I mean, I honestly thought it'd be something that was kind of hard. That's kind of put together last minute.
Yeah, we got county agent staff built back there.
That's right. Young ages sitting on posters
Well, guys, I appreciate it. Y'all have a good evening. Thanks for coming.